Hey y'all. So there are two purposes of this video. The first is we're going to identify and compare the reactants and products of photosynthesis and cellular respiration because you're going to notice there's a lot of similarities between them. And the second thing we're going to get from this video is being able to describe the purpose and the process of cellular respiration, because while we would get a generic overview, there are also stages that are involved in it, just like the photosynthesis. So it is key to note here that the whole purpose of cellular respiration is to take a molecule of glucose and to make energy from it. This energy is known as ATP. ATP is just an acronym for adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Now, ATP is found in all cells because every cell needs energy in order to do its functions. The function of ATP is to store and provide short-term chemical energy. Why do we say chemical energy? Because this ATP molecule is made through a process that stores the energy that it received from some other molecule, like light energy. How is it made? We take one glucose, and this one molecule of glucose will produce approximately 36 ATP through the process of cellular respiration, and this occurs in the mitochondria. What is ATP made of? Well, this right here is a molecule of ATP. It has three parts. It has an adenine, it has a ribose sugar, which we know is a carb because all carbs end in OSC, and it has three phosphate groups. 1, 2, 3. And I know the phosphate groups because I see the element phosphorus, and there are three of them attached to these oxygens. That is how a molecule of ATP looks on the cellular level. You might see depictions where it's look like lightning bolt or flashes. That is fine. Just know that this is the three parts of it. How is ATP actually used? We know that it stores chemical energy, but how do we get the energy from it? Well, it says here that the energy is stored in the bonds of the phosphate groups. So when we look at this picture, we see the three phosphate groups here. They're connected by these bonds. And in the bonds is where the energy is stored. So what happens is when you take the bond between the second and third phosphate and you break it, it is going to release that energy. And now the molecule goes from being adenosine triphosphate, meaning it has three phosphate groups, to adenosine diphosphate, meaning it has two phosphate groups. And when it's broken off, the energy is released, and that molecule of ADP isn't gone forever, right? ADP can get another phosphate group added to it and become ATP so that it can release energy again. So it definitely is a reusable molecule. And I can see that in this diagram here. So we see a molecule of ATP, and we see it has the three phosphate groups. And this bond between the second and third is broken, the phosphate is released, and so is the energy the cell needs. So what happens? We now have a molecule of ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and it only has two phosphate groups. And when it's ready, right, it will then add another phosphate group and absorb the energy it needs so that it can become ATP, and we can do the process all over again. And the purpose is that it is to break down glucose and make it into ATP energy that the cell is going to use to function. So what is involved in cellular respiration? The numerical equation is we take in 6 oxygen plus glucose, and you're going to make 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, and ATP energy. That is the whole process in a formula, which again, the whole point of this is for us to make energy so the cell can function, because we know our cells would not be able to function if it did not have energy. As I mentioned earlier, the process of cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. And just like the chloroplast, the mitochondria has various parts to it. And in these different parts are different stages of cellular respiration that occur. Or the first part of the mitochondria that we're going to mention is the mitochondrial matrix. And that's that inner light blue section. The second part of the mitochondria is the inner membrane. Remember, the mitochondria has two membranes. It's double membrane. You have an inner and an outer. And this particular inner part, which is like this lighter gray that we see, is another part of the mitochondria. And then the third location that we'll mention and you'll hear later on is the cytoplasm, which is also known as a cytosol. And this is a jelly-like fluid that is outside of the mitochondria. That's why we're not showing an arrow pointing to any place in the mitochondria, because it's not in the mitochondria, it's outside of the mitochondria in the natural cell. I do want to name that both animal and plants have a mitochondria. A good question arises. Since plants also have a mitochondria, can they do photosynthesis and respiration? Because remember, photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast, and only plants have a chloroplast. So we know that only plants can do photosynthesis. But since they have a mitochondria, can they also do respiration? I want you to take a second and think about this and write your answer down. Yes or no? Well, hopefully you chose yes, because plants can do cellular respiration. In order for us to take in the reactants and make the products of cellular respiration, it must go through 3 stages. The 3 stages are glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, which is also known as the Krebs cycle, because Krebs is the one who discovered it, and the electron transport chain, which we sometimes abbreviate as ETC. These are the 3 stages of respiration. So we're still going to take in the 6 oxygen and the glucose, and we're still going to make the carbon dioxide, water, and of course the whole purpose, which is energy. But it's just going to be done in 3 stages. What we're going to be talking about in this generic overview is the different locations these stages happen, the products that are made in these, the reactants that are also taken in, and then the different amounts of ATP that are made, and then whether the stages are aerobic or anaerobic, which is really, really important in understanding how our cell functions when we have oxygen available and when we don't. Okay, let's go ahead and define aerobic versus anaerobic. Aerobic means it is with oxygen. I like to think aerobic because it has air. And then anaerobic is without air. I do want to name for you that when we go through these stages, if I name that a stage is aerobic, this means it is very important to know that when an organism does not have oxygen available, that those stages shut down or stop functioning. But for now, let's go into the stages. So the first stage of cellular respiration is glycolysis. As you can see in this diagram, glycolysis occurs in the cytosol. You are going to label glycolysis as anaerobic. And remember, anaerobic means it is not dependent on oxygen. So that means when oxygen isn't available, glycolysis is gonna work. If oxygen is available, glycolysis is still gonna work because it's not dependent on the availability of oxygen. So either way it goes, with or without oxygen, glycolysis is good. When we look at reactants of glycolysis, you want to look at the arrows that are pointing into glycolysis. So what is being taken in? And according to our diagram, we are taking in glucose. When we look at what is being made, we're looking for the products or the arrows that are pointing out. And what is being produced or made is glucose is turning into this molecule called pyruvate. I know it sounds like a crazy word, but pyruvate. And also we see an arrow pointing out that's showing that 2 ATP are being made. So in the process of glycolysis that occurs in the cytoplasm, we are taking in one reactant, glucose, and we are making 2 ATP, and we're also making pyruvate. Now, the reason why I'm pointing out pyruvate, even though we know the whole purpose of respiration is to make energy, is because we can see in this diagram that pyruvate is needed to make this molecule that is needed for the Krebs cycle. So because it is dependent on these stages are dependent on one another, it is really critical that we name pyruvate as one of the products. So the next stage is the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is also known as a citric acid cycle. As we can see from this diagram, the Krebs cycle is occurring in the mitochondrial matrix. The process of Krebs cycle is aerobic. This means that it needs oxygen available for it to function. So if oxygen is not available, this stage will shut down. But if it is oxygen available, then we get to make this energy. So what are the reactants? Remember, we're looking at the arrows pointing in. So the arrows that I see that are pointing into the Krebs cycle is this molecule of acetyl-CoA. We don't need to know the specifics of what acetyl-CoA is. We just need to know that acetyl-CoA is the reactant of the Krebs cycle. Let's look at the products. What are being made? What are the arrows that are pointing out? So we see the arrows that are pointing out shows 2 ATP, and it also shows carbon dioxide. If oxygen wasn't available, that is 2 ATP that we're missing out on, and also we're missing out on carbon dioxide. Now the third and final stage is the electron transport chain. Where does it occur? In the inner membrane of the mitochondria. The electron transport chain is an aerobic stage as well. So Krebs cycle and electron transport chain are both aerobic. That means when oxygen is available, it's good to go. It's going to make the ATP that is needed. But when oxygen isn't available, it is going to shut down that stage and it's not going to be able to work. So just like the last two stages, what are the reactants that are involved here? Well, if we look at what's pointing in to this electron transport chain, which is also known as oxidative phosphorylation, is oxygen. We also see that electrons carried by NADH and FADH, which again are just electron carriers. We're not going to go that deep into this video, but just know electrons are being carried into the electron transport chain, hence the name, but also the main thing, oxygen. And then when we think about the products, what is being made in this stage, we can see two things. Water is being released, and 32 to 34 ATP are being released. This is huge. So that means electron transport chain produces the most ATP. So that means when oxygen isn't available, there is 32 to 34 ATP that we are not getting from the electron transport chain. And also there is 2 ATP that we wouldn't be getting from the Krebs cycle when oxygen isn't available. So oxygen being available to the organism is really important for us getting the most ATP. And then if oxygen wasn't available, would we still get energy? Yes, we would. We would get it through glycolysis, but we will only get 2 ATP and not 36 to 38 ATP that we can get when we combine all three of these stages. So to give a recap of cellular respiration, the whole purpose of cellular respiration is to make ATP. Take glucose and break it down and make ATP, which is energy for the cell, because the cell needs the energy in order to function. The overall formula for cellular respiration is 6 oxygen plus glucose, and we're going to make the products, which is carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. This happens in 3 stages. The first stage is glycolysis, which is an anaerobic process, meaning it does not need oxygen in order to be used. And in this stage is where we see our first reactant being taken in, which is glucose. And it's going to make part of our product, which is 2 ATP. Then in the second stage is the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. And this is where it takes in acetyl-CoA, which is not one of our official reactants, but it is a reactant that's taken in. And it's going to make one of our products, which is carbon dioxide. And it also makes ATP as well. And in the third stage was the electron transport chain, which is aerobic. This is going to take in our second reactant, which is oxygen, and we can see that here. And it's going to make our product of water, which we see here, and also makes more ATP. And it actually makes the most ATP. All of these make the ATP that is needed for our cells to function so that we can actually live. Hopefully that gives you some sort of overview or insight on the purpose of respiration and how these reactants and products are made in the 3 stages. I will see you at the next video.